How is everyone doing? Strength Chat episode 99, and today I have got a very special guest for you. Today I'm joined by a coach from 3D Muscle Journey. He's also a research fellow for the Auckland University of Technology at the Sports Performance Research Institute in New Zealand. That was a mouthful. But more importantly, he was also a guest all the way back in episode 42. Today I am joined by Eric Helms. How are you doing?
Well, it's a joy to be back on. My first two, Pete. So thanks for having me, and looking forward to our conversation, Stephen.
Spot on. So what's been obviously the start of a new year? What's sort of been going on in your world? How was your Christmas and New Year's? What's been going on?
Yeah, so pretty man. 2019 was a big and a busy year for me. It was the 10-year anniversary of 3D Muscle Journey. We formed it at the end of 2009, and so this year, both Jeff and I got back on stage, did a contest prep and competed in natural bodybuilding. For me, it was the last time I competed was 2011, so 8 years away from the stage. I took that time off intentionally while I did my second master's and PhD, and then I guess recovered from my PhD in 2018. And yeah, it was just a really, really cool experience. I traveled all around the world, really, spoke in multiple places during contest prep, and also started a podcast with Omar Isuf, which we've been loving, Iron Culture.
Yeah.
So it was a big year, and also had my first, as you mentioned, I was a research fellow here at AUT. And I had my first cohort of PhD students come out to New Zealand. I have a student from Malaysia. I have a student from Canada. I have a student from the US, and I have a student from Croatia who all are out just crushing it. And they're getting into the meat of their PhD in 2020. So that's big on the horizon as far as the research realm. 3D Muscle Journey, we've got some big plans moving forward into the next decade, hopefully, not just 2020. And then personally, I'm nice and healthy and refed, and no longer disgustingly lean, and more focused on food than anything else. I'm now focused on the gains again and getting strong. So I'm trying to do the trifecta in 2020 and do a strongman show, get back on the weightlifting platform, as well as getting back on the powerlifting platform. So that's the big news for me in 2020, is a little more focus on being Eric Helms, the mediocre strength athlete. So
I see. And have you, because I know you've done bodybuilding, weightlifting, and powerlifting, will strongman be, is that something you've done before, or is that going to be something completely new?
I would say sort of I've done it before. Right. So I did my last show August 10th of last year, I guess I should say. And I knew that I wanted to get into strongman. And in the last couple of years, there's been an organization, New Zealand Strongman Series, which has done a really good job of getting that robust. A lot of shows, well ran, really good group of people. Yeah. And there was a competition 4 weeks after my last show that was a max stone to 1.2 meters height with 5 attempts, right, and then a truck pull. And so it wasn't a full 4 or 5 event medley. But I thought it'd be a great entry-level event. So I got about 4 weeks of practicing stone, and pulling cars and stacks of weights and sleds and things like that. That was my first introduction. And then again, and exactly another 4 weeks after that, I competed in a much more like a powerlifting meet or Olympic weightlifting meet, but a strongman static event, the log and deadlift championships. It's kind of like Static Monsters, if anyone's familiar with that. But it was a max log, 3 attempts, and then a max strongman deadlift. So straps are allowed. You can hitch, just get it up, but only conventional, which sucks for me being a sumo puller and a substantially stronger sumo puller as well. So, but no, so I've done kind of two half strongman events. So I don't consider myself having fully competed in the sport until I do a full medley event, which is my 2020 goal.
That's more than me, because I know when I see the strongman on the television, and actually there's a gym not too far away from where I work that I've got quite a lot of strongman equipment, and they put on a novice competition. So a couple of members from the gym that I work at went and did that, and really, really enjoyed it, because competing in powerlifting myself, you sometimes think, wouldn't it be nice just to do something a little bit more than squat, bench, and deadlift? So maybe, I might have to have a look at a strongman competition. It's always something. It just seems fun. It just looks fun.
It keeps the fire burning for the iron. That's for sure. It's certainly a lot of fun, and it's a different way to kind of see. Real briefly, then we can actually talk about what you brought me on for. But Alan Thorall was on Iron Culture, and he said when he first competed in strongman, he wanted to see like, hey, what can this squat and this deadlift do for me? Like he was kind of looking at powerlifting as kind of like this very isolated expression of strength, while strongman, it's kind of like, even if you practice on the equipment, when you go to the show on the day, it might be quite different. Like I remember when I did the log and deadlift comp, we were competing in the rain on a platform that was on grass at a very slight incline, right. So my max log in the rain on an incline is a little less than what I did in a nice, flat gym. So yeah. But anyway, so it's cool.
You've given me a little bit of a teaser there. I was just going to ask about the Iron Culture podcast. I've got a bank of episodes that I need to catch up on. I think, I must subscribe to too many podcasts because my phone keeps saying there's too much storage on there. How have you found doing the Iron Culture podcast? Because on a complete tangent as a fan, if you like listening to it, it just seems like you have a good time doing it. Are you enjoying doing it? Is there any what's the plans for the future with it, or was it just a case of you just wanted to do it a little bit similar to why I set up the podcast, mainly because I enjoy doing it?
That's definitely a big part of it. I really get a lot from talking through thoughts. I'm a big external processor, which is probably why I'm pretty good at speaking. Is I'm able to be articulate and think kind of at the same rate that I'm talking. Sometimes I talk a little faster than I think, and it comes out a little muddy, but for the most part, that's kind of the way my brain works. And I learned very well from talking through things with people who I respect. And that's really what we tried to do. And so that's the part that I really love. But the part that I think has a lot of value is being able to expose the various niches of the iron game to one another. So for example, we just had Natalie Hansen, Bryce Krawczyk, and Mike Touchier on to talk about equip lifting. And I wanted to get them specifically on because they were all folks who I knew who had success on both sides of single ply and raw, who coached on both sides. And I think when you get a bunch of raw lifters together talking about equipped, you invariably, obviously it's going to be a limited conversation. It's all of their biases and preconceptions. And the closest I've ever done to an equipped meet is back in the day. I competed in a federation that allowed wraps. So it was like raw with wraps, which really isn't the same as putting on a squat suit or a bench shirt. So anyway, it was just really cool to get their perspective. And it was the first time I had been able to look at equipped lifting through the lens of someone who enjoyed it and could articulate that, instead of my lens of like, why would you do that? Like I knew there must be a reason because people did it, people I respected and liked and who are intelligent and thoughtful. And, but I couldn't figure out what it was. I just assumed, well, they have their reasons and teach their own. But after that podcast, I was like, you know what? I want to try that at some point. And I think it's that kind of experience that we want to give to our listeners, So we tried to get some like legitimate people who know about CrossFit on, legitimate people who know about strongman. We get historians on. We get scientists in different fields that I'm not intimately involved with. One of the benefits of me having ran around the world talking about bodybuilding is I get to meet a lot of people. So now I can kind of leverage that network to try to get some good information out to a lot of people. So that's kind of the motivation. And I knew with Omar's help with his relatively large YouTube platform, we could convert a lot of people to a podcast. Omar's been around for 10 years and he's had a very loyal following. So his audience went from being in their young 20s to now in their early 30s. And they have understandably moved from being not only advanced in terms of being lifters and athletes, but advanced in terms of how much depth they want out of their content. So it was a really good opportunity for Omar to have more long form content and to really dive in deep, because I think he really enjoys that. And we're both at a point in our career where I think it was a perfect marriage. So
yeah, there does seem to be quite a broad spectrum of guests that you've had on, which is really interesting to watch, because not interesting to listen to. Sorry, because not all of them have been the same, and there's a lot of topics there that I've like when you mentioned about the like I mentioned as a powerlifter myself, I've never done equipped powerlifting, but when you hear people equipped powerlifters talk about it, you kind of think, I wonder if I should give that a go. It's glad that you're enjoying it, and I look forward to sort of more episodes coming up this year.
Oh, cheers, man. I appreciate that.
No worries at all. So from the topics that I sent over when we first when I sent the email, and you sort of touched on it there about yourself being really lean. At the start of the year, a lot of people, I think it's a time where a lot of people will set quite a lot of goals and, plan out their training and nutrition and all that sort of stuff. And there is that common theme where people will say, right, well, I'm going to bulk up a little bit at this part of the year. I'm going to lean at this part of the year. And I think there's a lot of people who can be confused about actually cycling, getting lean, putting on muscle mass. What are your thoughts on having that as a cycle, and where do people sort of usually go wrong? Or is it even a cycle, or is it you get to a point and you maintain that and you just flip between the two, or is it a continuous cycle that you'll work on? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it depends on. I think for one, just to put it out there, you certainly don't have to go through these cyclical approaches to the traditional bulk and cuts. And I think there's probably a time in one's career where that makes sense for people who are coming from a certain background. So for example, if you're someone who is your entrance into fitness or powerlifting or the iron game in general is such that, hey, you want to get into shape because you're carrying more body fat than you want. And that healthy aspect or that, aesthetic change is a part of your goals, then, going through cyclical cuts and bulks is probably not going to be in the early stage of your career. You're going to be going through repeated phases of probably maintenance and cutting as you kind of learn to adopt new habits and you get down to, a body weight and a body fatness level that you feel is, met your goals and you feel healthier, whatever your reasons may be. So I think one thing that sometimes I feel like we do a disservice to is we speak to the kind of, fake mean that doesn't really exist. Like, oh, we just assume everyone's at a quote unquote normal body fat percentage who we talk to. And there's people who come to the game who walk around much leaner. And there's plenty of people who also walk around much less lean than that supposed mean. And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for someone who, might have started with just exercise classes and then got a personal trainer who happened to be a power lifter. And then they lost some weight and then they really got into it, but they still have weight loss goals that are concurrent with their strength goals. So I think in that case, the bulk and cut conversation is kind of like, yeah, that's nice. I'll consider that once I get down to a body weight I can sustain that is pretty lean. And it may be that at that point, it now is not making sense for your career. So what I mean by that is that once you get to a certain advanced level, especially as a drug-free trainee, going through cycles of weight gain becomes increasingly less effective over time. And what it even may look like, based on what I would recommend, is that these cycles become much less of a peak and a valley and more of kind of these shallow waves. Yeah. So just kind of as a practical example, if you are, competing in the 93s and now you've been lifting for 10 years and you've gained a fair amount of muscle and you're at the point where you walk around at 94, 95 at a pretty reasonably lean body fat percentage, and then you just do a tiny water cut to make the 93s, does it make sense for you to go through a cut and bulk cycle? Well, only if you actually want to move up to 105s. But if you're at 95 and reasonably lean, that may make sense. But what if that's not you? Or what if you put on those 10 kilos and your IPF score is actually lower? There's only so much more you can actually go. And sure, gaining weight does make you stronger, but your best bet for being proportionately stronger and more competitive in a higher weight class is to actually gain primarily lean body mass, or at least a significant portion of it. So, for example, I compete in the 93s. I've been as heavy as 100 recently, and I wasn't necessarily that much stronger. My bench went up.
Yeah.
So I have repeatedly tried, as someone who's now been lifting weight for 15 years, to do these bulks, and they become progressively less effective because I'm getting closer and closer to my ceiling for how much muscle mass I can carry. So I think in the early stages of a lifter's career, where hypertrophy is it's one of the many buckets that leads to strength, and if that's not very full, it makes sense to probably go through some of these cyclical periods, because it's very difficult to have an optimized period of muscle gain if you're not in a calorie surplus.
Yeah.
But how big that surplus needs to be is another question. And I think for the most part, for drug-free trainees, gaining, say, about 1% of your body weight per month is about the fastest I would go. So that means for most people, that's a dedicated year where you're attempting to get to, a higher weight class if you want to go that far, or just push your body weight up. And what I often see, the mistake that powerlifters do is they kind of, they see any weight between weight classes as kind of like no man or no woman's land. Like, why would I be here? I need to hurry up and get there, or I should just cut.
Yeah.
And the reality is that the only time you really need to be worrying about a weight class for non-ego reasons is if you're highly competitive, right? So there is a time where the thing you should be thinking about is, will I be more competitive as a 105 or a 93? This is something I've had conversations with Bryce Lewis about this. There was a time when we went, the 93s, it's a dogfight out there with the top 5. Let's see what happens when you go to the 105s. And now he's, a one-time world champ and a multi-time national champion. It was a good decision. But I think most people, the reason why I say ego-based reasons, when they think about it, it's like, will I feel better about my total if I'm a 93 or a 105? Will I be embarrassed? Will I have a Wilks score closer to 400 or something like that? You're an above average lifter, and you are potentially allowing your emotions to get away from making you become a much more above average lifter. So I think for folks who are not at the highest level, where they could go up or down a weight class and still have a potential shot at a national title or a European title or something like that, I think you just need to be comfortable with the idea that you might be, let's say you're 93 and you want to move to 105, you might spend most of this year between 95 and 99, and there's nothing wrong with that. And then next year, when you do get to 105, you're going to look the part, you're going to have more of that weight class filled out, and you'll probably have a better total. So I do think that in that process of that example of moving up a weight class, it does make sense to have these cyclical periods where you kind of quote unquote clean up, because you can't necessarily predict how efficient your lean mass gain phases will be. You're going to put yourself in a surplus. I gave some objective targets for maybe how much to gain, about 1% of your body weight per month, based on your genetics, how much of that time is spent doing accessory work versus the big 3, how much volume you can push through the system, your work schedule, how much you train, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, how efficient your nutrition approach to getting that 1% is. If that's just a really poor diet, let's say your protein is low and your vegetable and fruit intake is low and you're not very hydrated, but you're just in a surplus, it won't be the best lean gain you'll ever see. So you may have to kind of shave a few kilos off here and there as you go in that process. Decent rule of thumb that I totally just pulled out of my butt sometime in like 2009, I think on the bodybuilding.com forums, it seems to work well, is that the minimum ratio you should have of gaining to cutting is 4 to 1. So meaning if you spend 4 months gaining 1% of your body weight and you're up 4%, so you've gone from 100 to 104, just to make the math easy, and then you've earned yourself a quarter of that time. So 1 month of a mini cut. It doesn't mean you have to do it at that mark. Like if your body fat's looking good, your lifts are up, your IPF points are not going down, that's a good way to tell if your weight gain has been effective for your goals. Is then, okay, well, maybe I'll trim a kilo or 2 this month. And so you'll kind of have this process of going, I got to 104 and then I'm back at 102, but a little leaner. Then when I get back to 104 again, hopefully I look the part a little more convincingly. Yeah. So that's kind of a long answer. But I would say advanced lifters, they're probably not going to be going through these bulk and cut cycles. They're going to look very, very kind of minor. And like one day you look up and you go, oh, I'm carrying a little more than I want. I might trim it down. And for me, sometimes it'll be like, I think I was just mentioning to my wife today when we both got up and brushed our teeth. And I was like, I'm like 96 right now. And I was like, this is probably the leanest I've looked at 96 in recent times. This is good. Like I've had a very effective recovery period. My training's good. My diet's been on point. I've retained a lot of these good habits from prep, but I'm not, food focused or crazy. This is pretty cool, But again, that means like the last time I really did an objective physique assessment was back when I was competing in August. So it's August versus January. This isn't something you measure on a weekly basis as an advanced lifter. And I mean advanced just in terms of where you are relative to your best, not, you've got a 500 Wilks or something like that. So that's a relatively long answer. But I would say, just to kind of summarize it all, bulk and cut cycles make sense if you're not starting overly fat in the early and intermediate stages of your lifting. And then they become smaller and smaller, much more kind of like these protracted periods where you're assessing your body composition. And eventually you will settle into a weight class, and that's where you're purely creating a surplus because it's best for recovery for your training. And you might just have to periodically cut it back, but you're not trying to gain weight. It's just the consequence of being in a small surplus. Yeah. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, completely. It makes it interesting because, you look at people at the very, very top level, and you'll find that people, athletes will just settle out, and, you'll find that athletes will just stay in that weight class for quite a long time. Or you might find that actually, that they're slowly come up the rankings, if you like, then all of a sudden they've gone up a weight class and they've gone from being an okay lighter lifter, and they've got heavier and are now challenging for national titles. But I think sometimes people forget that at that top level, when you are challenging for titles, you don't want too much fluctuation within anything. I would say, because then that way that might have a bigger detrimental effect on your performance when there's records or titles at stake. I think, and I've experienced it myself, and I'll try and explain as best I can. But that's why I want to pick your brains on this. Is that I started off, when you were saying there about 90, 95, 96 kilos. I actually looked back at my very first competition, and I did compete in the 105s, but I think I weighed about 97. 4 or 5 years later, competing in powerlifting, I'm now in the 120s, under 120s. But my lifts have. I'm not saying I did it all perfectly. There was a point where I'd put weight on, but it was nowhere near where I wanted to be, and recovery suffered. I would find between sessions I was just feeling really tired. Changed the nutrition around when I had a little bit of an off season, did a little bit more of a body recomposition, if you like, and then now that little step back, my lifts have now progressed quite a lot. And I think sometimes, what you're saying there about when people are just starting out, I think sometimes people can just want everything at once or stretch everything out for a long time. So they might want to get really lean, but get really lean when they're building into a competition, which wouldn't necessarily be what they want to do, because that's where they want to lift the most on the platform. Does it, when you mentioned about the starting point for different people, is there a point where you would just focus on, right, we are just going to focus on dropping and getting relatively lean? Or would there be a point on the other end of the spectrum where it's like, right, okay, we actually need to not worry too much about competing, we just need to get size on this person?
Yeah, I think both of those scenarios can happen. If someone is coming to it relatively under-muscled, they don't have an athletic background, they tend to be an under-eater, and they are either lean or just overall just small. That's one of those cases where we go like, let's just focus on eating and getting stronger. I think there's nothing wrong with someone competing early on. It's just that you don't want them to become too wrapped up into it. I'd like to see someone really perfect the skill of lifting, enjoy the experience of it, and not identify as a powerlifter too early, so they don't risk burnout. I think you want probably it's kind of like you want a robust relationship before you propose to someone, right? Everyone worries when you propose after 3 months to someone, because how well can you know each other? Mm-hmm. Do you have a deep enough intimate relationship to where you can have that commitment to where the marriage is going to last, right? And it's kind of the same thing with lifting. you've been lifting 6 months, you're like, I want to be a powerlifter, I want to get on the powerlifting platform. Your only knowledge of lifting is powerlifting. And then if you have a bad experience, if you get hurt, if you don't meet your goals, you can get burnt out and you don't have anything to fall back on. I know a ton of people who get burnt out on powerlifting, but they still lift. You don't want to be the person who gets burnt out on powerlifting and doesn't lift. And then if you do find that passion reinvigorates, you've got a much further way to climb, versus going, all right, I've only been squatting like every other mesocycle, but I've been doing all this other stuff in bodybuilding. It's really a quite easy transition. Within 3 weeks, you might be back up to with 90% of your old numbers. Yeah. So I think for the early stages, people who are just getting into training and don't have a lot of muscle, they can definitely compete to get their feet wet, to try out to see if they like it. But I think the goal should be to develop proficiency and to establish a base, both of motor learning and of muscle mass. And then in the other case where someone is, quite heavy and one of their goals is to just get lighter, healthier, and establish new habits, I think before I ever want that person to start thinking about making weight for certain weight classes is for them to be able to walk around at a healthy body composition that they are comfortable with emotionally. And that's going to require true lifestyle change. Yeah. I think when you don't have that underlying relationship with food that is healthy and those habits that are sport supportive that are just kind of ingrained, and you cut weight to make a certain weight class, essentially the only thing that is keeping you from gaining weight or not having a good relationship with food is the fact that you're cutting for that weight class. And that becomes this tedious process that each time you're stressed for competition. In some of the cases you were talking about where you see someone go up a weight class and they do a lot better, sometimes it's not that they put on all this muscle mass that they could have. It's that you weren't aware of just how stressful each competition was for them. That they had to cut 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 kilos in a 2-hour weigh-in period for them to compete in the weight class they're competing in. I know some very high-level 93s who walk around in the off-season at the same weight as some of the high-level 105s I know. And I'm thinking, and I also know that their off-season numbers are higher than when they compete. So they're kind of in this trap where they know they're competitive in this weight class, but it's a really difficult process for them to get there. And that leads to burnout as well. It kind of puts a ceiling on them. And the competition experience always sucks. I mean, if you think about it, what would you associate with competing? The only thing that's going to keep you there is if you get gold or if you do really well on the platform. And that can partially overcome the fact that you hate the process. Cutting that much weight sucks. You're dehydrated, you're hungry, you're frustrated, you're nervous, you don't know if you're going to make it. You're spitting in a cup. Sometimes you're taking diuretics and laxatives and doing all this crazy crap. It's unhealthy. You feel bad. And you're about 10% weaker than you were at your peak strength. So you've got all this momentum going in. And then as you get into the competition, you're getting less and less confident, more and more stressed. And it's very difficult to be happy about your performance from an intrinsic perspective because you're squatting, benching, and deadlifting, 5, 10% less than you normally do. So the only thing you have to look forward to is, well, hopefully that's good enough for a medal. And then you're putting all of your appreciation for it in this extrinsic thing. So I think that's why sometimes you'll see someone go up a weight class and all of a sudden that stress goes away and the numbers that they could hit go there and it culminates in something that actually is better than the weight class they were in. Yeah. So anyway, to answer your question, I think before someone starts playing with weight classes, they need to first establish their base level of muscularity. And then 2, their base level of healthy body fatness, if you will, and relationship with food that they're comfortable with and they can walk around in, and that they would maintain that weight if all else was the same, if they weren't intentionally trying to gain weight or intentionally trying to cut weight. That's when I think someone can then think about what weight class would make the most sense for me. But for the most part, I would caution beginners and intermediates from trying to make weight at all unless they're close. If they're within spitting distance. Like if you find that walk around weight is, like 94, 95, why not just, if you know what you're doing, it's not even a true cut. In the last 24 hours, you go on a low fiber diet, you don't drink water after dinner, and then you have breakfast after you weigh in and you make the 93s, it's really just kind of like an IF for a day with a slight change in your diet. No big deal. However, if you're 97 or 96 or 98, just compete in the 93s. I mean, you're not vying for a world title. And it may be that if you compete frequently enough, that is going to get in the way of your progress. Yeah. I think One thing that is semi traditional in powerlifting that I would say people might be surprised to hear this, is that I'm not a big fan of people actually dieting last minute to make weight for a competition. It's very normal. You know, the standard process is someone's walking around 3 kilos over their weight class. They know they can reliably cut 1 or 2 kilos in the final week, but that means they need to diet off another 1 to 2 kilos. And they basically leave that for the last 4 to 6 weeks. So they've got this perfectly arranged mesocycle or multiple mesocycles set up for this comp. You know, they go high volume, taper down into intensity, and then actually go through a competition taper for 1 to 2 weeks. It's supposed to be dropping stress. And then what do they lay on top of that? A calorie deficit, a huge change to their lifestyle, and a water cut. So when you're supposed to be de-stressing, you've added a whole new wrench to the mix. And I see them retool their taper, retool their mesocycle. It's like, maybe it's because when you're supposed to be recovered, you're throwing a whole new dietary stress in there. I'd much rather you get the cut for body weight done early and then trial in advance the water cut. So, you know, okay, I can reliably cut 1 to 2 kilos. That's there. I'm not going to be nervous about it. And I'm walking around only 1 kilo over my stage weight. Sorry, my platform weight. Yeah. And I cut that 3 months ago. And now I can do my taper. I can do my intensification cycle. I can drop volume and not worry about having to layer a cut on top of that. And then I just manipulate my diet in the last 4 days and I'm good.
You mentioned a couple of times there, you know, stress and worry. And, you know, you mentioned that the first, when people are just getting involved, you just want to start enjoying lifting. You just want to, you know, find out what you actually want to, or what people actually want to do. I think sometimes as soon as there is a weight category put on anything, the first question I always get asked is, also, what weight category do I need to be in? I had a guy compete last November and he was a kilo over the weight class, and that was after breakfast and using his own scales with clothes on. So I was like, right, well, yeah, you're a kilo over. That's nothing major. He weighed in. There was other things. I think maybe we needed to chat a little bit more because it was his first full competition. He'd done like beginner competitions. He ended up weighing in. He stopped eating a lot further, a lot earlier during the day before, just to double check. So he actually weighed in a lot less. So there was we had to have a sit down and have a little bit of a chat of, I don't believe it, I was a kilo over, why was I so under? But just chatting about that. But I said, there's no reason. I said, you can compete in whatever weight class you want in your first competition, because, you know, if you've got to that point, okay, you've realised that you want to do powerlifting or bodybuilding or whatever it is, and you want to enjoy that first one and then worry about it if you're climbing up those rankings. I think when we first started sort of talking on this question of if people are you know, underweight or overweight, I think there's a culture at the minute where people want to associate themselves as a powerlifter when they're training, or a bodybuilder when they first start training. Whereas, you know, for me, with the not to sound harsh, but with a lot of the powerlifters that I coach are beginners. You're a powerlifter once you've competed. You're a bodybuilder once you've, you know, competed on stage. You're a strongman once you've done a strongman competition. Then once you've done that, then you can be like, right, am I going to focus on powerlifting, or am I going to do something else? You know, from a beginner's point of view. And one of the main things that you said there is, for me, when people are first getting into training, you know, their health comes first, and then you can focus on performance afterwards. Whereas if you're coming in and your health is neglected or is put at risk from doing your performance, it's sort of getting it the wrong way around. You know, keep your first goal the goal, and then you can work from there. On the flip side of that, though, because you can often see people who have maybe intermediate or advanced lifters from bodybuilding then going to go compete in powerlifting, and powerlifting then wanting to give bodybuilding a go. Does sort of the whole cutting and bulking change from person going from sport to sport? Is one better than the other? Is there things that powerlifting can learn from bodybuilding and vice versa? What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a couple of ways to look at this. You know, I think 3DMJ is pretty well known for athletes who compete in both. both amongst coaches and our athletes. But most of that stemmed from bodybuilders who are following what we think is probably the best long-term athlete sustainability approach, which is not competing on an annual basis. Because dieting to get as lean as the competitive bodybuilding division requires these days is very strenuous. And you can have lasting effects that are pretty lasting. You can mitigate this. This isn't the norm, but there's one case study of a female drug-free figure competitor who did not get her menstrual cycle to return for a year and a half after a competition. Wow. And that's just one of the downstream effects of being in the status of low energy availability. Relative energy deficiency in sport is very common, almost obligatory by the time you get into stage weight. A lot of the things we associate with diet fatigue just come from that. So to get to these incredibly lean levels, the process of the amount of calorie deprivation you have to do, energy expenditure, and the mental state that puts on you and the fatigue you experience can be both physically and psychologically traumatic. And then there is a recovery period, and there should be. And sometimes that recovery period is such that competing again the next year, if you are able to fully recover, by the time the recovery is over, you have to start your diet again, because it can be a 6-month process to get lean, which leaves a drug-free competitor with basically a handful of months at most where they're not recovering from being in a deficit or in a deficit. So the likelihood of actually improving year to year is slim, and the improvements you can make are going to be pretty minor. So it really only makes sense to start like competing back-to-back years if you're like defending a championship title, or if you're competing in your 40s and you want to really get the last bit out you can before it becomes harder and harder to make progress or sustain that peak. So anyway, so if that is the reality, if we're recommending our clients compete no more frequently than every other year, which is what I did in my early career, 07, 09, 2011, then you're dealing with people who are competitive athletes, who have strong desire, and who have off-season goals that typically include, a bodybuilder has obligatory cut and bulk periods, right? No one walks around in the same condition they get on stage with year round. Even the lean people you see still have to cut a little bit. And then the recovery period is an intentional weight gain period. So at the very least, even if you have someone who doesn't subscribe to cuts and bulks, they cut for competition and they gain weight after competition. So there's that obligatory element. And then most bodybuilders, since their primary goal is muscle mass, regardless of whether that comes with strength, they will be using these cyclical phases of cutting and bulking to ensure they're in a surplus, and then to not be too far away from stage weight, because that can make for a very long or rigorous diet, both of which are not great for muscle retention. So the demands of bodybuilding enforce a cut bulk cycle on people. And I think that's something that has been borrowed by powerlifters, but probably doesn't need to be borrowed. And kind of going back to the early phase that I talked about. So the reason why we would recommend, or at least put forth the idea of competing in powerlifting for bodybuilders, is it would get them to focus on progressive overload, training with the big three. They would learn more about periodization, volume, intensity manipulations, frequency manipulations, becoming better skilled lifters, and what we like to call diversifying their happiness portfolio. Because if you are wholly identified as a bodybuilder, it's very difficult to appreciate and enjoy the outcome of your sport, except on like one day, So, if once you get good at it, and if you come from a background of having been a recreational bodybuilder before you competed, you can learn to love the off season and getting big and being like, so I'm not cut, but these are the biggest my numbers have been. I've done more workload in the session. I'm filling out my shirts, etc. I don't have striated glutes, but I know when that's only this time. But that takes some mental gymnastics. A lot of bodybuilders fall in love with the way they look on stage, and that's what keeps them coming back. But that can lead to these very sometimes depressing off seasons. So giving someone another goal, and an objective goal as well, to not focus on their physique, to see if they can move their numbers forward. And I would say out of all the iron game sports, bodybuilding and powerlifting probably line up the most. It's very easy to create a bodybuilding program that includes some work on the big three: squat, bench, and deadlift. It doesn't require much, and doesn't even necessarily all have to be heavy, but it's quite easy to make a bodybuilding program that incorporates those movements. And it's very easy to, once you get close to a meet in the off season, you basically just do a powerlifting program and you throw in some curls, calf raises, rear delt work, lateral raises, and hamstring curls. It's not hard at all. And you certainly won't regress. And then the net benefit might be close to optimal, as far as it also gives you if you look at your stage weight, you can figure out, well, what's a reasonable weight class for me to go up to? And then it can give you some objective limits to how much weight you can gain in the off season. So for example, I compete right around 80 kilograms in bodybuilding. So 13 kilos up from that, that's at my height and my stage weight, that's like a perfect cap to my off season, And so I just get a little bit above 93, and then I cut down for powerlifting meets. And I can walk into the 96s for weightlifting, or I can cut a little further. And it's kind of same thing with strongman with the 90 kilo cutoff. So these weight classes allow a bodybuilder to have some more objective goals, structure, focus, and limits on their off season, and keeps the fire burning, the coals hot, if you will. And it requires very little manipulation of their training to get there. Now, for a powerlifter who goes into bodybuilding, they're going to notice a few things. For one, they're going to find their training is overall less strenuous if they do it right. And they're going to find that the aches and pains, especially in the lower back and the hips, can be drastically reduced. And I've met a lot of powerlifters who actually really enjoy, maybe not long-term, but the initial break from having to do the same volume on the big three and being able to do things like hack squats, leg curls, RDLs, and doing all these movements. If they're doing it right, sometimes they just kind of just do like bodybuilding rep ranges with powerlifting, which is typically a great way to feel even worse. Yeah. But if they, embrace movements that have a much lower, fatigue relative to the stimulus, then they could find that training can become less fatiguing per unit of volume, more effective for the goal of hypertrophy at least. Yeah. And they can get they can get pumps. They notice muscle groups that were previously neglected are starting to grow. And they see all these benefits, and they can be quite fun. It's a good change of pace. But I noticed there's very few powerlifters who fully make the switch from powerlifting to bodybuilding and stick with it. Yeah. Much more commonly, you'll see people switch from bodybuilding to powerlifting and eventually go, you know what, I could leave the diet. I'm just gonna stick with powerlifting. In fact, I can't think of a single person I know who was in love with powerlifting and then switched to bodybuilding and just stayed there forever. Yeah. So that's less. I'm sure it happens, but it's much less common. And so I think in that case, what powerlifters can learn from bodybuilders is being more attentive to the details of nutrition. Mm-hmm. Like instead of just kind of whatever the seafood diet for their bulks, intentionally getting in a certain amount of protein, a little more nutrient timing, considering things like the overall quality of their diet, like the micronutrient density and how much fruits and vegetables are in it and things like that. And having a little more of a lifestyle approach to nutrition. If you read my blog post, The Default Diet, that's a great idea of how to create like a skeleton for a sports supportive nutrition plan, to where you can get away from necessarily having to track and just having a nutrition plan that meets the goals of your sport, that you can just, increase or decrease portion size by subjectively gauging your hunger or satiety. I think it's where you want to eventually get to. That's a different topic that we'll probably talk about, but I think that's what you can really learn as a powerlifter from bodybuilders, is having a little less of a kind of a blunt object approach to nutrition and being a little more fine-tuned. Yeah. But I think do that in stages, the bodybuilder learns this because they end up trying to optimize and micromanage everything because they're trying to get shredded. And they do such a deep dive on nutrition and push themselves to the limit of what they can handle in terms of managing things physically and mentally, that they understandably are able to retain some habits in the off season if they do it right and stick with the sport and have a reasonably healthy relationship with it, to where it's ingrained to do all those things I discussed. To where the powerlifter, I don't think there's not a natural process by which that happens. You'll more often see powerlifters go on kind of blanket or shotgun approaches when they make weight. Like, all right, I'm going to cut out carbs. I'm going to, go on a low fiber diet, go to the sauna, fast, and, do like 5 different things to make weight. And basically it's going to heavily restricted diet for a very short period. Crash diet plus a water cut is a very, very blunt tool and compared to the micro manipulations that bodybuilders do to preserve as much muscle mass as possible. Yeah. And I don't think you need to go to that extreme degree, but there is probably a middle ground that's much better.
Yeah, I think when you mentioned there of bodybuilders not going over to powerlifting, I've been to competitions before where you get chatting to people and they have done bodybuilding and they have just thought it's just nice to have a little bit of a break just to do powerlifting. I know people have powerlifters wanting to go to bodybuilding just because, when you have that off season and there's a few more curls thrown in there and you use a couple more machines, you sort of get caught up in the, oh my God, I might look like Arnold Schwarzenegger one day. It's gonna happen. Mm-hmm. I think, that I have seen that myself. And when you mention about nutrition, you can see that, like you say, trying to get shredded, and I've spoken to coaches who, other coaches in sort of my area who I'll program a lot more for the strength side of things and just sort of getting people to lose fat. But there's other coaches who I know who will specifically target on getting people shredded, and the nutrition plans, like you say, are a lot more fine-tuned. I think sometimes people, like what we were chatting about, when people first want to sort of associate themselves with something, if they do struggle with nutrition, they can sometimes gravitate towards powerlifting because the joke was, oh, I can do powerlifting, I can eat what I want because I'm only bothered about getting stronger. But now that I think powerlifting is growing a lot more, and I think it's becoming a lot more professional in how people are looking after themselves, looking after their nutrition. I think slowly, because bodybuilding has always been everything is covered in terms of nutrition. How much am I eating? What am I eating enough? What's happening with that? I think powerlifting is slowly becoming they're becoming a little bit more aware of, and it's slowly becoming to a point where people aren't just saying, oh, well, I can eat anything I want. I can, like you say, I can go on the seafood diet and just go through the weight classes. Similar to what, exactly what I did. You do that phase where, I'll just have, I might have a pizza and I'll throw some potatoes on there as well. Whereas actually, you just end up feeling rubbish for it. And the better that you're eating, the better your performance is. In terms
if you don't mind, I wanted to say one thing on that. I think a lot of that comes from the changing leadership voices in powerlifting. There was a time, like if you look at the dominance of Westside, kind of before social media, they're sort of the first folks who really had a platform to speak from through Louis Simmons' articles. And I can think of Dave Tate and a few others who had big name like the Bells. They were dominated. The dominant voices were equipped super heavyweight powerlifters, and getting your weight up had these very measurable improvements in performance because they don't care about their Wilks score. This is the era where they'd say things like there's no weight classes in the jungle, and dominant advice was, we'll go up a weight class, like almost without even knowing the background of the person. There's the expectation of you should be gaining and going up weight classes over time. And I think now, where we see powerlifting is damn near 40-60 women, men. And we see some of the like, I would say that while probably Ray Williams is like the most dominant figure in terms of popularity in the IPF, like Taylor Atwood, a 74 kilo lifter, is very prominent. A lot of the female competitors are very prominent. There are lightweight, middleweight, and, non-super heavies who are looked up to just as much, who are coaches as well and have very respected voices. And because the sport overall has grown so much, not everyone, it's not just attracting a bunch of guys who are trying to become super heavyweights. You're seeing men, women, juniors, masters across the spectrum of weight classes. So the nutrition advice is more reflective of that, I think, to where if that advice was followed by some of these lifters who were really good lightweight competitors, they would be average middleweight competitors, Yeah. So I think you're 100% right.
Did you just touching on the when you mentioned about West Side there? Have you watched the documentary West Side versus the World?
I have not. Is it good?
Yeah, I would recommend watching it because it is an insight, and you just sit there thinking, "Wow, this is an insight into something that I don't think." Especially when all the lifters start talking, and I can't remember the guy's name, but when you just mentioned there about you've got to get heavier, and he talks about a conversation that he has with Louise Simmons, and they've gone out for breakfast, and he's sat and he's having his food, and Louise Simmons says he orders him some more. I think he orders him some more food, and the lifter's like, "Why have you ordered me more food?" He said, "Oh, I think you can squat a world record, but I think you need to go up a weight class." Now, at this point, he was already having health issues. He was going to the doctors quite a lot. And at that point, the lifter turned around and just said, I can't do it. I can't go up. I can't put more weight on because it was, he was worried. He was worried about his health. And it's interesting what you say there, that at that time, it was a case of, look, if you weren't a super heavyweight, if you weren't lifting, the maximum amount, it was a bit more of an ego thing, if you like. Whereas, like you're saying now, there's in terms of actually watching, because I watch the IPF Worlds, it's really competitive. All the weight classes are really competitive, rather than just the super heavyweight. So I would recommend watching West Side versus the World, because it is very interesting. Yeah.
It's on the list, and it's definitely something that I've been intending to watch. So I'll have to make that part of my my 2020 goals of viewership.
Yeah,
but yeah, I mean, I remember when basically a good total in the, like, I guess back then it wasn't the 105, like the 242s or the 220s or the 198s was seen as like, that's nice, little man. Like these are the training wheels. Like, when are you going to move up? Yeah. And it was just a different era. Like, I remember the early strongman comps, there was 275 and under and 275 and over. Like, that's, so if you're under 125, you're a lightweight, kilos for the non-Americans listening, which is just ridiculous, So it's definitely changed. And I think that has given more I think that's perfectly good advice for super heavyweight lifters. Don't get me wrong. But, I remember reading an article on T Nation. I think it was by Dave Tate. I don't want to ascribe something to him that wasn't him, but it was definitely like a West Side super heavyweight kind of thing. Like, and the prescription was, if you can't gain weight, the best thing to do is order a large pizza and pour olive oil all over it. And like, just get it in, and like, to have that be an article, like, to anyone who can't gain weight, it's coming definitely from that bias of, like, the kind of situation you talked about, where I'm already a damn near super heavy or a 275, or I'm up there and I can't gain weight. What do I do? So I think it's good. It's good that we have more nuance now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was just, I could just picture that the scene on the documentary when you were saying that, and how it describes it. It's just, you think now it's like, why, how would that happen sort of now, if you like. You mentioned it a little bit about sort of the nutrition side of things and tracking. Now that we've sort of covered the whole cutting and bulking and maintaining and leveling out, and you mentioned the blog that you wrote about putting a skeleton together of how to work around your nutrition. Now, when it comes to cutting and bulking, a lot of people will go on MyFitnessPal or whatever it might be, and they'll track everything, and they'll make sure that they're always over on protein, or if they wanted to cut weight, they'll massively restrict everything that they're eating. What are your thoughts on, does everyone need to track? Is it the best way, or are there other alternatives that are a little bit more people can drop in and out of to make it a little bit more efficient for them? What are sort of your thoughts on that?
I like the way you framed that question. I think if you talk to most good fitness professionals who will use tracking as a tool, it is best used as a tool, not as a, here's just what you do, So in many cases, the reason why you would have someone track from a coaching or trainer perspective is to teach them about nutrition, so they understand globally what the kind of food labels are, because you have to look at it when you start entering food. You see, you're getting experiential knowledge of what is dominant in carbohydrate, fat, protein, what's high in calories, etc. But also, hopefully, when you're tracking, you're asking the person or you're asking yourself to keep track of how you feel about the food you eat and keep track of your habits. The initial time when I have someone track, if they've never done this before, is not with the intention of hitting certain targets, but rather to uncover what they're currently doing and to help them understand why and what they are doing. So they are aware of that donut they ate at work. So they are aware that they go 6 hours without eating when they're distracted at work, and then they get super hungry and they go out for takeaway and they overeat and they feel guilty afterwards. And then once that awareness is there, that's when you can start to see what are the obstacles to my progress, and then how can I turn them into stepping stones? What exchanges can we make? What modifications to habits can we make? What food replacements would be good to fit that same category, but might allow me better alignment with my goals? Or what habits can I put in place on the weekend of like making sure I go grocery shopping, or making sure I do buy certain things at the grocery store, but not others, that out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. Yeah. So it becomes this tool to teach someone about lifestyle change, rather than I'm going to just hit these targets all the time, because that is not actual lifestyle change. There is a nice model of mastery, skill mastery, and it follows this 4-step process. There is first unconsciously doing something incorrectly, right? This is the person who doesn't know anything about nutrition, and does not know to do better, right? And then once they're taught about nutrition, that's when they go to the second phase. And then once they become aware of their own nutrition, and that is consciously doing it incorrectly. And this is basically kind of goes hand in hand with stages of motivation, what would parallel here, because this isn't just learning a skill. This is also lifestyle change, because nutrition is how we connect as humans. It's how we celebrate things. It is how we cope. Sometimes we have an emotional response to eating. So, modifying someone's nutrition is not like modifying their training. Training is optional. Eating is not. Yeah. So there's this intersection between skill development, and we can look at some of the theory there, and lifestyle and behavior change, which we have to look at there. So acting like I'm a machine, I eat for performance, is almost always going to cause problems down the line, if not immediately, because you're not a machine, no matter how much you identify with that kind of philosophy. So you go through unconscious incompetence, conscious incompetence. That's where, like, at least what you need to change, but maybe you're having trouble doing it. This is where a coach can be very helpful, to then consciously doing it correctly. And that's where the if it fits your macros, track everything approach stops you. And I think that's okay in only certain contexts. Like, for example, if you are a bodybuilder dieting down to extremely lean levels, getting to the fourth stage, which is unconsciously doing it correctly, is pretty much not going to happen, because your natural settling point, your hormonal environment that tells you how hungry you are and how much food you need, the leaner you get is going to tell you eat more. Like, this isn't healthy. And it's not healthy. Like, let's be 100% honest here. To get into the kind of stage condition you need for a competitive physique sport, you have to go past the point of having a sustainable body fat percentage. You get to photo shoot lean, which maybe is slightly leaner than you'd maintain, and then you got to drop another 10 pounds, to get that look. So it is something that is inherently unsustainable and inherently would require conscious focus to maintain or achieve. So, that phase is where you stop, and that's why tracking your macros or hitting certain calorie targets or following a strict meal plan is pretty much the 99.9% way of approaches that successful bodybuilders use. Yeah. Now, that's fine. But if your goal, like we talked about, is to establish these healthy habits and to have a sports supportive environment for food that allows you to get stronger and allows you to stay or move up or go down to the right weight class, that should be able to happen in a much more integrated way with your lifestyle. So tracking as a tool to change habits, great. Tracking as a replacement for habits, not so great. And it means that you never get to the phase of mastery. Someone who is a quote unquote macronator, and it's like, oh, I can go anywhere and I got my fitness pal on my phone. I scan my food. I can hit my macros just by going to the grocery store and all good. You're a master at being not a master, in my opinion. Someone who has truly mastered the nutrition is hitting around the right appropriate targets for their macros without having to track their macros. The whole reason you track something is to ingrain a behavior. Like the whole reason people get a Fitbit and get their 10,000 steps is because they want to have a behavior. The goal is to be more active, not to walk 10,000 steps. That's just some objective way of tracking it. You know, there's the saying, what is measured is managed. And that's true. But at the same time, nutrition is part of your lifestyle. Nutrition is part of being human. And once you've established these new habits, this new lifestyle, tracking it forces consciousness. And it forces, especially if you're trying to stay too lean, which is a different problem in my opinion, it forces restraint. And restraint is pretty much always shown to not last. You have to basically adapt a new approach to the way you eat. And tracking is a tool to get there. It is not getting there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at it. And yeah, I always, what you've said there means that how I'm getting people to change and improve their nutrition isn't going too far wrong. Just one thing I just wanted to touch on there, because and just see what your thoughts are. A lot of people, as soon as we sit down and we start talking about, right, whatever their goals are, okay, what previous nutrition have you done? Do you track your nutrition? And everyone does sort of think that, oh, well, tracking must mean I need to use MyFitnessPal. I need to track my calories. Mm-hmm. When you're talking about tracking, do you mean, because I've had some clients, not necessarily, I mean, I do have a woman now who is a nutrition is a lot better and she's wanting to compete in powerlifting just because she's enjoyed the strength training side of things. And we started off just, right, okay, can you write your food down? Well, I don't really have time to write my food down. Can you send me photographs of your food? And that got her a habit of her thinking, oh, well, look, I can't really have this because, you know, at the end of the day, there's someone there to be held accountable. Would you say that tracking is just for your calories, or would you say just tracking is just, you know, monitoring your food in whatever way is best for that client?
Yeah, this is a really good point, because tracking can mean different things in different contexts. And you cannot track calories and you cannot track macros, and you cannot have a MyFitnessPal account, and you can still do some form of journaling or tracking that is actually facilitative towards developing habits. We actually have a course coming out through 3D Muscle Journey in our 3DMJ Vault, which is kind of like our online school of the sport, if you will. And it's called Transitioning Away from Tracking. And that's something that myself and our registered dietitian, Steve Taylor, are going to be releasing in 2020. So little teaser, plant the nugget here, because this is there's a lot to be said here. Yeah. But to give you kind of the high level overview, there's a difference between internal and external cues. So an internal cue is something that your body generates that tells you when you are hungry or when you are full, and when you should eat and when you shouldn't. An external cue could be anything from trying to hit targets on MyFitnessPal to walking outside and passing by Subway, and you weren't thinking about food, but it was in the morning and they're baking those damn cookies, and then you slow down and you go back, and now you can't stop thinking about cookies. And now you're eating a cookie not because of an internally generated signal, but, well, it is an internally generated signal, but it's in response to a sensory cue. Yeah. Right. So the external cue is a sensory cue. The external cue is MyFitnessPal telling you to eat this much, etc. Now that can be useful. You can set up, external cues to help you reach your goals, like I talked about using MyFitnessPal and targets for bodybuilding. However, it doesn't lend itself towards auto-regulation, which in most cases, if we rely on millions of years of evolution, we can get a slightly better individualized approach than trying to estimate it and get there with like a macro calculator. You know, you go on this website and you estimate what your maintenance are, or even use a more sophisticated approach where you track your body weight for 2 weeks with your normal habits, and you see whether you're gaining or losing, you calculate your surplus, and then you're off and away. The reality is that you're going to have a plus or minus 10 to 20% variance on your energy expenditure on a day-to-day basis from what that average was. So if you assign yourself 3,000 calories, and that is your maintenance, but on some days you're eating 3,300, and on some days you're eating 2,700, you're actually fluctuating in and out of a deficit and a surplus. Yeah. And then if you go, right, I want to go through a weight gain phase, I'm going to tack 300 calories on top of that. I mean, some days you're going to be at maintenance, and then some days you're going to be in a too big of a surplus, and you're going to get to the point where you're just gaining fat on those days and then not losing it when you're at maintenance. And you're going to actually have a less lean bulk than if you took an auto-regulated approach and you modified your portion sizes based on internal cues.
Yeah.
Now, the obvious question to that is, well, how the hell do I use internal cues? Like, I don't know how much to eat. And I think the answer is, well, you can learn that, and you probably do know better than you think. In the modern food environment where we have food affordable, highly tasty, high calorie available to us all the time, and no job almost requires you to be active unless you're an actual laborer. Here we are, powerlifting coaches, and what are we doing? We have desk jobs. In the 90s, we would actually be in a gym floor 8 hours a day, but it's changed with the internet and Skype and Zoom. So the reality is that we have poorly regulated hunger signals because we're inactive. Getting more active, getting your step count up, that can help that. That shows that non-sedentary individuals have better regulation of hunger and satiety. So getting your activity levels a little higher, look at that. Health can actually help performance. Who knew? And then the second step is you can actually create a system to become more aware of your hunger and satiety. So you can rate hunger and satiety on a 1 to 5 scale. And you can just basically not change your nutrition habits, but just like I was saying, hey, you can use tracking your calories to see what your habits are. You can simply track your satiety and hunger and see, okay, I'm currently maintaining my weight. And on average over 2 weeks, my average hunger and my average satiety are this on a 1 to 5 scale. So I know that is where I will sit in that band for maintenance. And if I get myself a little fuller, that's probably going to be a surplus. And if I get myself a little less full or a little less sated or a little hungrier, like one skip down, but not so low that I'm starving, that'll probably produce a deficit.
Yeah.
And then you can really start to do things to modify it. Like, okay, well, what if I increase my fruit, my vegetable, my water, and my protein consumption? And if I have regularly scheduled meal times, and at each meal I have a serving of protein, a lean serving of protein, and I have a fruit or a vegetable at each meal, what's going to happen? Well, the overall satiety index of all my foods has gone up. So my overall diet will be more satiating. So I might find that even though I'm in a deficit, I'm in that old hunger and satiety band that was my maintenance. And now I'm walking around 1 or 2% body fat leaner. And so this is why we have as humans what's called a settling point rather than just a setting point. The set point theory is based on this hard physiological line of the amount of fat mass our body's supposed to have. We secrete this amount of leptin, and that results in what we walk around at. Well, the obesity epidemic has shown us that that's simply not a hard line. And there probably is some physiology related to that, but it can easily be overcome by environmental cues, sensory cues, food availability, and all these external factors that I talked about. So if you can modify your internal environment, you can find out what kind of the low end of your settling point is. And that's why here's a great example. I have done like reverse bodybuilding. If you look at my off seasons of where I've started each prep before I've gone down. I started my first prep in 2007 at about 215 pounds. I started my next one in 2009 at about 210 pounds. 2011, I started at 200 pounds. And then in this last year, I started at 195. Right. But my stage weight has either been higher, the same, and leaner all throughout that time. So I am basically starting at a leaner point each prep. And that's not from me dieting before I diet. That is me establishing behaviors in life that lead me towards being closer to my lower end of my settling point. And that's where I want to be, but eating at maintenance before I start a diet because it makes the diet easier. So the long answer to your question is that you can track using internal cues. And the problem with tracking with something like MyFitnessPal and using pure external cue guidance is that you actually disassociate yourself from your hunger and satiety awareness, and you actually get worse at those skills. And that has been associated with disordered eating patterns, weight gain, and some problems. Sometimes, not all the time. And definitely, there's a time and a place for using tracking, especially, like I said, to originally gain awareness of things or for short-term goals that require going past what is sustainable. But if you're trying to incorporate new habits, you can use tracking to track your internal cues and actually improve your awareness of your satiety and your hunger and what you need, and whether this actually is you being hungry physiologically or is it just a craving. Did I just walk by Subway? Like, am I actually hungry right now? If I let this settle, if I go read a book for a bit and pass the time, will that go away? That kind of thing. So there are different ways of tracking. I think it is much too black and white of a statement to say tracking is bad and not tracking is good. But I will say that for long-term goals, for sustainable lifestyle change in the off season, for anything that you intend to keep, you need to have getting to that point of mastery, that unconscious competence, if you will. And I don't see hitting certain numbers and needing to use MyFitnessPal on a daily basis as congruent with that.
Yeah, quite glad we sort of touched on that topic, because I know, and this is something I get asked as a coach as well. And like you said, I don't think it is black and white. There is a little bit of a grey area when it comes to tracking, and it's not always right. Well, this is the way that you've got to do it. A little bit like, you know, with the hunger, because speaking about going back right to the start when we were speaking about clients that may be a little bit underweight and need to put muscle on, or clients that are a little bit overweight and need to drop down. Essentially, it's their habits, like exactly what you say, and behaviors. You know, do you need to, like when you mentioned about satiety, do they need to just drop the amount of food that they're having? Because the amount of times that I've had people or clients that have come in and mentioned about their tracking, but it is just a case of, right, well, actually, quite a lot of you, because with the calories, the whole thing of if it fits your macros, I think sometimes people want to use it as a way to cheat themselves and then leave a little bit extra and be like, oh, well, I've got a few calories, so I can have this. Whereas the common theme that you were sort of saying throughout that answer was make them build behaviors. Because again, it goes through, and it's been sort of dropped in throughout all the little conversations within this chat of it's got to be with health and, you know, enjoy food, because it isn't. I mean, there's a standing joke with a couple of my friends that I just think of food as fuel. I do have quite a big appetite, and I'm quite happy to eat. But I also enjoy having, you know, nice food and having a sit down meal and eating something else. Yes, it's a little bit different if I know, you know, I've got a couple of hours before I train and I just need to get something in. But exactly as you say, there's an emotional response to food, or, you know, if you're out with your wife or girlfriend or family, and, you know, you actually want to sit down and enjoy it, rather than, you know, always looking at your phone and doing, you know, looking at your calories. Because I think, you know, there's a little bit more to that. I think what I've learned from the clients that I've worked with, when they're not tied to the phone tracking calories, it becomes a little bit more, I don't know whether it's the right word, but a little bit more natural, a little bit more, they have like I think what you mentioned, that, you know, a better relationship with food, which, you know, when it comes to sort of the cutting and bulking side of things, I think people can get it wrong by going too far the one way and wanting to actually, you know, drop things down a little bit. So yeah, I thought that was a really good answer, and sort of got to the point of what I wanted to chat about. We've covered quite a lot of stuff in there. I enjoyed chatting to you. It was before, and I really appreciate you jumping on this time. From everything that we've chatted about in this episode, what would be your take-home points or words of wisdom for everyone listening?
Yeah, I think the biggest take-homes are that, yes, there are ways to optimize your performance with nutrition. However, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. If you pretend or like to think or idealize yourself as like this machine cyborg who only eats for performance, and you primarily identify as a power lifter or any athlete, that is probably going to, what I like to say is that some of these behaviors that ignore your humanness get you immediately to a B+, but then hold you there. Because the overall philosophy of trying to change your environment, expecting your environment to adapt to you so you can be better at your sport, rather than integrating your sport goals into your life, is you're betting on the wrong horse, right? You can control what you do. You have the ability to modify your life and to change your perspective on things, and to understand how you can relate to others. And, you know, changing your perspective is the difference between two people in the same scenario, one being happy and successful and one being depressed and unsuccessful. So it's our reactions to the world that we have power over. So the people who, like you see this in bodybuilding, the people who isolate themselves from their friends, don't go out to eat, only become friends with other people, consume only bodybuilding information, hang out in a bodybuilding gym, and make their life all about bodybuilding, they're basically trying to just go through the wall. Like they hit some plateau, they weren't able to get to where they wanted to be, and they think the answer is to be more hardcore or more secluded. And that in the short term will get you greater results. But it is almost inevitably unsustainable. And every time I've seen that happen ever in my entire career as a coach, that person eventually figures out some way to find a sustainable approach they can integrate with their life. I remember back in 2005, before I'd ever competed in bodybuilding, I met a gentleman in his late 40s who was a competitive bodybuilder, and I expressed an interest that one day I wanted to compete. And he looked at me, and I could tell he was choosing his words. And I didn't really know the value of what he told me at that time. I was expecting to say something about, oh, you're not big enough, you need to work on your delts. Like I was all super like focused on the minutia. But he said, bodybuilding is best done as a lifestyle. And I nodded and smiled, but I really had no idea what the hell he was talking about. And it really didn't hit me until I had a disastrous first prep where I got into great shape, got super hardcore, changed my entire life, tracked my macros, did some things that were unnecessary. I wouldn't combine carbs and fats, and I ate every 3 hours. I did the best I could with the knowledge I had in 2007. But then I blew up and I gained almost 50 pounds in 2 months because I had no lifestyle to fall back on. And I didn't get as lean as I wanted to either. And I think the bodybuilding media at that time would have told me, hey, you got to get even more hardcore. You got to just have the willpower to stick to your diet in the off season and control your rate of weight gain. And I would have, basically had to develop an off season eating disorder with that approach, and then get even more hardcore. Like, got to separate those carbs and fat further. I got to do more cardio, push that pendulum even further, and then plant my feet and get ready for it to smack into me, but not get pushed off because I'm just that hardcore. But in reality, what led to my success was figuring out how to integrate my life around bodybuilding. And here I am in 2019, getting the leanest I've ever been, and being able to travel, going out to eat, not tracking for the first third of my prep, et cetera, et cetera. And I got that because I expanded my comfort zone and increased my skill set, and I integrated my life with the Iron Game rather than trying to make everything fit the Iron Game prescription that I thought was best for myself. Yeah. So I think the best way to, if you are so focused on your sport that it hurts your relationships or your job, then the stress you're going to get from your relationships or your job are going to hurt your performance. Yes. So that's what I mean by not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think you need to take a more holistic, long-term approach if you want to have a career in the sport, or at least have the choice to have a career in the sport, versus getting as far as you can in the next 4 years before you burn out.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to finish it, and that's what I try to put. Across to the clients that I work with. Again, a couple of sort of key terms we'll put all the way through that. All these wanting to get really lean, wanting to bulk in, tracking and everything, and all that, and all those other factors. Stress plays a big factor in this. And actually, when you're wanting to achieve what you want to achieve, sometimes you're actually hinging yourself a little bit more by creating all those other stresses. Lots of good topics covered. For everyone listening who either haven't listened to episode 42 when we last spoke, or want to see what blogs and content you're putting out there, or listen to the Iron Culture podcast, where can people find you or get in touch with you, whether that be through training or just looking at the content that you're putting out there?
Well, I appreciate that, man. Thanks for having me on again. It's an honor. And if you want to hear more of my thoughts and ramblings, you can check out, probably the first place to go is 3dmusclejourney.com. That's the number 3, the letter D, musclejourney.com. From there, you can find our free blogs, podcasts, and also a link to the vault, where we have about a 50-50 mix of free and paid courses. And even our paid courses, you can get about a third of it for free to sample it. In addition to that, the two other places where you can find what we do, or what I do, would be Iron Culture Podcast, which is on Spotify, iTunes, and YouTube, and also just me on Instagram at Helms3DMJ. And between all that, you can find the links to my books, the research review I'm part of, et cetera, et cetera.
Spot on. 100% everyone listening. I know I said it before on the last episode when I spoke with Eric. Check out the work that 3D Muscle Journey do. I look at a lot of the blogs that they put out there, and the content is really, really valuable. And if you haven't already, 100% check out the Iron Culture podcast, because you can see that you enjoy the podcast when I'm listening to it. So thanks a lot, Eric, for taking the time to chat with me. Thanks a lot to everyone listening, and I will see you all next week.